Hello, my name is Lewis and welcome to Deep Dive. This is a channel to be able to discuss and review new releases. The whole point that this is made is because if you know me from the House of Tabula, you know that I don't really get as much of an opportunity to discuss new cinema. When I actually started out, when it was Channel Criswell back in the day, I was actually reviewing films that were new at the time. And I wanted an opportunity to be able to recapture that because I think it's important now in modern discourse to have a voice that is able to discuss films without it being very internet-centric, or at the very least just to have an opportunity to discuss it in the grand scope of cinema, that it doesn't just feel isolated to the present era, that we can talk about films now but still referencing the whole history of cinema. That's basically what I'm doing. And this is my first solo review in like 10 years, so bear with me while I fumble my way through this. But the first film that we're going to be talking about is Paul Thomas Anderson's One Battle After Another. Now, I thought of a myriad of ways that we can start speaking about this film, but I think first and foremost, because Paul Thomas Anderson is quite well known, particularly in today's milieu of filmmakers. He's one of the more popular filmmakers that exists. I think it's important to just give a bit of context going into this film as what kind of Anderson film is it that we're watching? Because Anderson, more than most of the new school filmmakers that exist now, he has had quite a prolonged career to the point that we can determine specific stages and determine what kind of Anderson film it is. His first era was primarily influenced by the 1970s movie brats, most notably Martin Scorsese, and outside of that, you can see in works like Boogie Nights, he's just wearing Robert Altman on his sleeve. Those big ensembles, that chaotic landscape that he wants to capture. Up to a certain point in his career, his films were drenched in this kinetic energy, but they still held this fundamental sentimentality towards people. And then all of a sudden, his lens just completely changes. Most notably with There Will Be Blood, Anderson started to approach characters almost on a cosmic level, in the sense that the way that Anderson's lens was attuned to the human condition, it just had such a richness to it. When you look at films like There Will Be Blood and The Master, they carry such a depth to them. And it's a lens which was so mature that it was actually quite surprising that someone had such a radical shift in their approach to filmmaking. Although ultimately, you can see that some of those interpersonal relationships which defined his earlier work, they were still present in his new work. And it's not that his earlier work was superficial by any means. I love his early work. But the drama existed in things like Boogie Nights and Magnolia on an interpersonal level almost exclusively. And it was only in his later work that that richness started to reveal itself on top of those very rich interpersonal dynamics when we think of someone like Daniel and Eli. And so that brings us to One Battle After Another, because we have these two very distinct periods of a filmmaker. And so we ask, all right, well, what kind of film is this one? And the truth is that it's neither. It's now the third phase of Paul Thomas Anderson, which ultimately is a hybrid. One Battle After Another follows several aged revolutionaries after they've finally chosen to settle down in their lives, as much as one can settle down when you've spent your youth as part of a leftist militia trying to upheave society. And there we're introduced to Bob, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, who now spends his time in a kind of quasi-revolutionary state. His idea of resistance is lounging around and watching the Battle of Algiers. You know, it's just a right amount of resistance that keeps a fighting spirit alive, in theory more than in practice. But without revealing too much of the necessary plot points, essentially what happens is that Bob, Leonardo DiCaprio's character, is brought back into the fray of a revolutionary mindset through necessity, because his daughter is captured by a corrupt military official called Lockjaw, played by Sean Penn. Now, the film is based on Thomas Pynchon's work Vineland, and it's not the first Anderson film to do a Thomas Pynchon adaptation. It's very interesting to see anyone do a Thomas Pynchon adaptation because Pynchon's writing doesn't really lend itself to the cinematic medium. One of the features of his writing is that there's just this wide excess in his work. Pynchon's perspective is a very maximalist, almost confusing landscape of the United States. And what that ends up resulting in his writing is that you've got this postmodern approach to narrative, which is intentionally confusing. The way Pynchon's world is set up, he will create these myriad of factions that have these kind of very loose connections to one another. The result is that you become narratively lost, but that's the point of it. He makes information so dense that it becomes hard to follow, even if you try your hardest. But Anderson understood that when he made Inherent Vice, and what he did was just embrace that chaos. And he created a character of Joaquin Phoenix which was lost in the ether just as much as we were. If you try to follow the narrative, you won't be able to keep up with it, and the character wasn't either. Anderson never encouraged the audience to try to understand what was going on in the work, and that was why it worked so well. Except that you don't know everything. You probably don't even know anything that's going on. But that is the satire at the heart of Pynchon. The American landscape does have so much going on, that there are so many leaders at the same time, that ultimately the world is left rudderless. I actually thought that the Coen brothers would have been more suited to Pynchon's style than Paul Thomas Anderson, because their approach to satire and the United States is one where everything becomes a cosmic joke, that things do unravel, that you do have characters disconnected. But you can kind of see how Paul Thomas Anderson has adopted that lens, even in One Battle After Another. I mean, Leonardo DiCaprio's character, there is a very dude-esque, Big Lebowski type character within there, even to the point that he is so disconnected from the events that are going on within the film in the background. And he also goes around with sunglasses and a nightgown just as the dude did. He has that lazy, do-it-yourself kind of charisma. But now we should actually probably talk about this film. What's it about? One Battle After Another is about many things at the same time, but also they kind of contradict one another, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. One of the things that I felt watching this was that it's an incredibly American-centric film. Now, one of the flaws of most modern cinema that I find is, in fact, that they are American-centric. And by that, I mean that the way that they view the world is through the US lens. And the main thing that that causes is this kind of default perspectivism, that this is the way that the world is, not that it's just isolated to a single country. However, when I say that One Battle After Another is an American-centric film, I think that this film honing in on being an American view helps the film tremendously. Even though it comes from Pynchon, which is a kind of 1970s rebellious edge, it is set now. And because of that, it's set in a modern political climate. And I find it funny that out of all times in history that we speak of, a generational division within the world and how separate we all are, we need something to bond us, we need something to bring us together. Out of all the major blockbusters that we get from an art house director, we get One Battle After Another, which in many ways people are going to look at and say this is the worst possible film you could release now. But I think that we should take a step back and actually understand what that means. The reality is that I don't even think that the highest heights of the arts necessarily need to represent the reality in which we live now. But if we are going to represent reality, if we do want to see visions of the world as it currently exists, if we want political forms of cinema, then we should represent things the way they are now. And sometimes that means displaying that division. Sometimes that means displaying that fear and hatred that everyone has for one another. And this landscape often leads people to view films and art in ways that maybe they shouldn't. Some people are going to watch this film and say, oh, it's against white nationalists, epic. And there's going to be another group of people that are like, oh, this film likes fucking refugees. Ugh. That's not the best way to watch this film. I think that what we have to understand is that there's a validity in making cinema about now and showing things as they are, even the things you don't like, even supporting the things that you don't like. And it doesn't mean that that is destroying the social fabric. It means that it's displaying the social fabric to you. It means that we're trying to show a lens that exists now, rather than obfuscate it. Just show it as it is. Because, for instance, I think of someone like Ernst Lubitsch and a film like To Be or Not to Be, which is made smack bang right in the middle of World War II, talking about Nazism and Hitler and all of these horrific acts which are destroying the world, millions dying, and it's making jokes about them. It's making jokes about the worst, most frightening thing you could possibly imagine. And to a certain degree, I think that perspective is somewhat present in One Battle After Another also. This notion that there's immense division, that there's domestic terrorism that's going on all the time, and we can satirize it to the point that, I mean, you can even sympathize with it to a degree, which ultimately leads into what this film is more so than a political film, which is surprisingly quite a humanist film. The film itself is Paul Thomas Anderson's probably first film with a narrative. Most of his other works are character studies, or they just examine the vibe and the milieu of a space and time, but this is a very classic inciting incident, climax, denouement kind of film. And I think with that structure, it does a couple of things. Because for one, while the film does have this necessity of a political landscape, for 2/3 of the film, it begins to serve more as a backdrop. And primarily what the film does become is, more than anything, a piece of entertainment. Bob is essentially a character on a classic hero's journey. He's trying to save his daughter from an objective evil played by Sean Penn. While the outskirts of the film are speaking of politics, Leonardo DiCaprio's character, he's focused primarily on the insecurities that emerge through fatherhood, and he kind of just blocks out everything else. His revolutionary mindset is one of necessity. The only reason now that he's kind of reclaiming this power of fighting against the system is because it became personal. Family is a major theme of the film, and it emerges right at the beginning. Tiana Taylor plays the partner of Leonardo DiCaprio and the mother of his child, and she is fantastic, actually, in her representation of a revolutionary mindset. She is a freedom fighter, first and foremost, before anything else. But the film actually does a very good job at discussing what this actually means within a person. What we find in the film is that there is a blurring of the individual and the political. And with that, does it begin to elucidate on all of the human complexities that are within us, that are tied to these power dynamics? There's this fascinating blurring of power and sex that's made vividly apparent from the very beginning of the film. And it makes you start to question, what and why do we believe the things that we do? Do we believe certain things because if you are a revolutionary, if you do want to upheave society by all means, that is the absolute goal for every person, then everything else falls to the wayside, including family. That means that everything and anything can be sacrificed for your beliefs. And then you can argue that social revolution becomes a personal act, almost as a Kantian perspective, that every action that you do, regardless of its charity, regardless of your altruistic nature, is ultimately selfish. And I think as much as the film likes to sympathize with its characters, it also puts them to the test. It asks them, if you are a revolutionary, let's see. Let's see what by any means necessary truly means. It's why I think that One Battle After Another does have a degree of nuance in how it examines extreme political ideologies and even political people in general. It's easy to be a revolutionary when you're winning all the battles, but when things don't go your way, when it's time to display, okay, how much do you really believe in this, then you have to have the courage of your convictions. And whereas Tiana Taylor as the mother does display that in spades, Leonardo DiCaprio's character kind of moves away from the revolution and begins to focus more on the familial mindset. The revolution occurs in many different forms, that the idea of raising a family, that the idea of having people that you're responsible for is its own kind of revolution. But then at the same time, the ability to do that while not assimilating to the norms of society is the real battle. And it's something that goes on constantly. It's one battle after another. Because what you see with many of these characters is that many of them are willing to abandon their beliefs for either some kind of personal gain or to protect their families. And we don't look down on these people because anyone would. There's both benefits and cons of how the film structures itself in its relationship of narrative, of the personal and the political, of this idea that you have these characters which are determined to change society by any means necessary, but then we are so focused on the familial, on the more superficial aspects, the individual. And the reality is that you can look at this in any kind of manner, because there's a part of me that enjoys the film's ability to be able to show the discrepancies within people, that you can believe two things separately of, I am a revolutionary, but at the same time, I do want to raise a family. But then at the same time, there is this feel within the film that maybe it doesn't quite stick the landing, because it spends so much time on the extreme end of social upheaval that it does sometimes feel contradictory that we would just move that to the wayside when things got a bit too hard. It's human nature, but I think it's something valid when you have characters that the way they interact with each other is through Jill Scott Heron songs, and the very structure of the United States is systemically evil. There's something about falling to the nuclear family which can be seen as a contradiction. And look, like any humanism in a film, the idea of exalting the human being is something that I'm very drawn to within cinema. Like, I'm a Catholic, but at the same time, I understand, I understand what it's like to have schisms within a person. But the irony is that even the things that I actually believe more of, I'm actually more interested and enthralled in the ideas of characters returning to the familial, returning to these close communities. I actually think that the film would have been better with a more radical mindset, because it kind of reaches this milquetoast middle ground by the end of the film that I don't think supports the nature of what the film is. I mean, yes, by all means, I enjoy examining the discrepancies and schisms within people. However, there is also something to be said that perhaps the film would have benefited more in its message by committing more to one side or the other, because it espouses such extreme perspectives. But returning to the film itself, the filmic style, I feel that Anderson is someone that can never remove his odes. One Battle After Another feels in many ways like an attempt to recapture the kind of 1970s exploitation films of the era, more so than any other genre, I think. Because even those films of the 70s, they were warped pastiches of previous films that existed before those. And for instance, Johnny Greenwood returns as a collaboration with Paul Thomas Anderson. For the first third, he's using borderline Spanish guitars that sound like a spaghetti western. And then only in the second and third acts of the film do we hear those discordant tones that become more associated with Greenwood. And it actually benefits the film very well, because the film, after the first act, it really becomes this exciting snowball of events, and it keeps going and going and going. And the score kind of has this bubbling crescendo to it, which fuels the film very well. But yeah, there is a playfulness with Anderson's perspective towards cinema. Like, when I was watching this for the first hour, I was thinking of something like Sweetback's Badass Song. It's playing around with stuff, but at the same time, it's talking about something that's quite serious. But it's done in an approach with a kind of renegade, rebellious nature, where he's even trying to say a bit, fuck it in general to any kind of cinematic expectations that we might have. This is a 70mm IMAX epic, and it kind of deconstructs all of the genres that we have of cinema. It kind of is a big action film where our main character is just totally removed from that action. We have this amazing performance by Sean Penn, who plays a borderline T2 model rigid villain of a man that is so incessant in his, I wouldn't even call it a belief system, because the interesting thing about Sean Penn's character is that there is no firm foundation for what he believes. He himself, well, here's the thing. Sean Penn's character himself displays more contradictions than any of the other characters. He wants to join this white supremacist group known as the Christmas Adventure Club, which I think is a wonderful name. I think that kind of psyop perspective of underground factions that are so alien in their structures that they become almost farcical is something that I'm very drawn to. And I think that the ability to have this borderline satanic Christmas cult that works underground in order to keep a racially homogenous country is a wonderful inclusion to mainstream cinema. But Sean Penn's character is exactly that, and it's something that you see within Pynchon, in which things aren't explained, and it's one of the instances in which they aren't better to be explained. It's good that there is this enigma of why Sean Penn is the way he is, why he has this racial obsession across the board that's completely contradictory. But it's okay, we don't need that, because he's such an excess of a character that does exist. And that's the best thing about when doing a satire, is take things to the edges. Because when we extrapolate the way things are, then we actually sometimes can understand the reality of the situation more. There's a lot that the film does. There's a lot that the film talks about. There's a wonderful sequence that, again, I think that's the epitome of what Anderson is. There's a chase sequence in a car, and it's not a French Connection style chase sequence that you may have anticipated in the earlier period of Anderson that he would do. This is a Hitchcockian chase sequence. This is a chase sequence on a straight road that's done so wonderfully well that I do wish, because he displays such a formalism in his filmmaking here, when you see things like that, you think, this is the right way to make films. And I'm glad that he has this postmodern, very fluid form of filmmaking. He's just so good at that I could just have him do that. One Battle After Another ultimately asks us what kind of people we are today. What is it that we stand for? And ironically, it comes out the other end purporting humanism more than anything. Samuel Johnson said, when speaking of Shakespeare, and I'm prefacing, it's something along the lines of, when examining human sentimentalities, that a mirror is held up to you, and that you are more than what you believe. And I think this is a sentiment that carries itself through One Battle After Another, that as human beings, we are more than our ideologies, we are more than what we believe, but at the same time, we are fundamentally the things that we believe. And there's a complexity by the end of the film that I think the film deals with, and I think it would have been better if it didn't display a solution to that. I think the schism within that is where most of the intrigue lies, and the most interesting aspects of the film deals with those contradictions between people and between individuals. The ongoing battle, one battle after another, that occurs within oneself, where you feel yourself constantly tugged to and fro between the dichotomies of life. And ultimately, to be any kind of revolutionary being, you find yourself on constantly unstable ground. The irony being that the film finishes with everything kind of wrapped up in a neat little bow, which from a satirical perspective I enjoy, from a deeply philosophical perspective, which I think the film offers a lot of, undoes a little bit. The truth is, it's a wonderfully complex and ambitious piece of cinema that must be analysed also within the lens of Paul Thomas Anderson. Because I would ask you, as much as the film succeeds across the board at so much, I think, does it have that depth and that richness of something like There Will Be Blood? No. It deals more on interpersonal levels than that. Okay, then does it have that romanticism of A Phantom Thread? No. Because it's also focusing primarily on the chaos of the world, and those interpersonal relationships kind of get reduced in the scale of everything. So, does it embrace that chaos on an inherent vice? I'm not sure. It's the same. Every aspect that makes Paul Thomas Anderson great is kind of muted here for the benefit of breadth. And this isn't to diminish the film. If anything, that's more of a testament to how much the rest of his filmography exceeds. People may consider this to be the greatest film that he's made. I'm not even certain that it's in his top 3, but that doesn't make it a bad film by any means. I think the fact that this film can even be considered amongst his oeuvre is something that the film should be highly regarded for. So, ratings. I don't really rate films by numbers. I haven't done it, but I can. At the same time, it seems kind of arbitrary, which it is, but at the same time, I do like numbers. I do like scales and rating films. So, yeah, why not? 7.5 out of 10. So, thank you all for watching this. I hope that I am better at this in the future. I just wanted to say that, this deep dive channel, it's supposed to be a new avenue under the House of Tabula in order to just further a bit more discourse in the cinematic realm. I've become very distasteful of a lot of the conversation that goes on about cinema nowadays, and I just want there to be a voice, not make a fucking big deal about me being a personality or anything. I just want to have interesting conversations about film, and that can be like whether the film is a masterpiece, highly regarded, or whether it's something average. I still want there to be enough discourse that's just isolated within that piece itself, as well as talking about all of cinema, how it relates to the story of all of art. That's the aim for this channel. I hope you enjoyed. I hope I get better. But again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you all next time.